GDI clearly plans to overthrow the United States government and replace it with their own.
Well, lemon chicken piccata is a lot harder to make than I ever gave my mom credit for. Welcome back to my series on the Brotherhood of Nod. Today, we're diving headfirst into every nugget of info I found on what the Brotherhood was doing prior to the start of the First Tiberian War in the late 1990s, as well as what exactly Cain's cult believed, both politically and religiously in this era.
Greetings. It is I, Cain. But you knew that, didn't you, my faithful friends?
According to the original Command & Conquer game manual, the date of the founding of the Brotherhood is unknown, although they claim to have been formed as early as 1800 BC, maybe even earlier. The closest reference I can make to a Western audience is that this would have been around the time the Bible claims the Israelites started their tenure as slaves in Egypt. Moses wouldn't arrive for another 400 years or so. So smack dab in the middle of the Bronze Age. Still not as old as the pyramids, by the way. Once again, we return to Command & Conquer Renegade to find our only two pieces of evidence that the Brotherhood, not just Cain, existed in centuries past. In General Ravishaw's manor in the mission The Grip of the Black Hand, the player can find shields decorating the walls with a telltale Nod scorpion symbol adorning them. Now, this may be decorative in nature only, or it may indicate that the Brotherhood has been around since the days of the sword and shield, placing the Brotherhood at least as far back as the medieval period. And let's not forget, General Ravishaw is the leader of the Black Hand, so this is fairly high up in Nod's hierarchy where we find these artifacts. The other piece of evidence is back beneath the Temple of Nod in the final mission of the campaign. Once again, we visit what could very well be Abel's tomb, see my last video. When Havoc approaches the sarcophagus, Cain speaks over, well, presumably a PA system of some sort, and makes some very interesting claims about this site.
Bow your head, Arthur, you walk on hallowed ground. How disappointing to see that you have no sense of history. This is the original site of the Brotherhood's temple, the true source of Nod's power.
You're making this up as you go along, aren't you?
I didn't think you would understand the significance. A man of your intelligence couldn't possibly comprehend.
If Cain is telling the truth here, then the Brotherhood itself as an organization may very well have been founded here in Cairo, Egypt. Also, remember, this location may not have always been underground. Civilizations in centuries past typically build on top of old cities in an upward trend. Any sort of real archaeology in ancient places like Rome or the Holy Land usually involve digging several layers down to find old roads and buildings from older versions of a given city. If Cain continued this trend, it's very possible that the Temple of Nod we see in Renegade was built over a much older temple's ruins. Heck, in CNC3, Cain returns to Sarajevo to build yet another temple after the first Sarajevo temple was destroyed in the First Tiberian War. So it's not like this is out of the norm for him. So does this definitively place the Brotherhood of Nod's creation as old as the death of biblical Abel himself? Well, I don't think so personally. If the people at Westwood responsible for writing the Hebrew that shows up here knew anything about the ancient language, they'd know that Hebrew as it was originally written in the Bible would be what we call today Paleo-Hebrew, a more ancient version of the language whose alphabet resembled more closely something pictographic. It wasn't until around 500 BC that the modern Hebrew alphabet that we see written here was fully in use. Now, it's possible that the Brotherhood of Nod existed prior to the creation of its first temple, in which case its claims of existing as far back as 1800 BC is at least possible. Perhaps, Cain's definition of what constituted the Brotherhood is far looser than we might expect. Perhaps it wasn't until closer to 500 BC that the Brotherhood coalesced into a more stable religious group that built its own temples. Perhaps prior to this, the Brotherhood was simply whatever disciples Cain could gather for himself as he waited for man's technology and culture to advance. If this is the case, then we can separate Nod's history into 4 eras of pre-First Tiberium War activity. The Discipleship Era, as I term it, stretches from around 1800 BC to 500 BC. This is when Cain first stops working alone and begins to gather followers. If I had to speculate, I would say Cain would be using this time to sow himself into the legends and stories of various cultures around the world, playing the long game so he can later ingratiate himself with disenfranchised nations and cultures on a global scale. I'll explain why I think this in part 6 of this video later on, so put a pin in that. Also, Cain may have already been practicing infiltrating powerful empires as an advisor, like he later does with the Soviet Union in the 1950s, as we see in the original Red Alert where he's Stalin's advisor. My only point of evidence for this is that in Tiberium Dawn, Cain claims that he named Tiberium after Tiberius Drusus Caesar.
Tiberium is named after the Tiber River in Italy where it was first discovered.
Discovered by the Brotherhood, that is, and I named it after Tiberius Drusus Caesar.
Now, this exact name does not appear anywhere specifically in history, but may be referring to any of 3 different Roman figures with similar names. If it's Drusus Julius Caesar, the son of Roman Emperor Tiberius, that would be most interesting, as he was murdered, most likely by his advisor, a Roman prefect named Sejanus. And you'll never guess how the murder was done. So get this. Sejanus is said to have seduced Drusus's wife and convinced her to poison Drusus. Does this sound strangely familiar to the end of the Soviet campaign in the first Red Alert? The parallels with Stalin, Cain, and Nadia feel like, to me at least, like that could not be a coincidence.
Cain lives! And indeed I do.
The Secret Society era starts at around 500 BC with the construction of the first Nod Temple in Cairo, Egypt. A religious canon is beginning to be formed, with tenets and rules to be followed. In addition to the formation of the Brotherhood proper, I believe Cain's goals now are to aid humanity's technological advancement more directly. This falls in line with Cain's dialogue in CNC 4 under EA Los Angeles' framework of Cain as an exiled alien.
I have spent thousands of years trapped here working towards this. I found you people in mud huts. You were living in caves. I raised you to triumph. I guided you every step of the way.
However, even if Cain is the biblical Cain, as under Westwood's presumed framework, Cain would still benefit from preparing humanity to receive the gift of Tiberium. I assume Cain is also collecting any alien artifacts from around the world, ascribing religious significance to them to ensure their procurement and protection by the followers of Nod. Remember, Cain needs to be able to predict exactly when and how Tiberium will arrive on Earth, so he can prophesy of its arrival as his followers claim. Of course, if Cain is an alien, then he perhaps already knows when Tiberium will arrive, approximately. Now, while Cain doesn't get his hands on the Tacitus, an alien data matrix with untold information about Tiberium, until the Second Tiberium War, it's likely that he was searching for it, or artifacts like it during this time period. This would explain the Brotherhood's early knowledge of how to harvest and refine Tiberium before anyone else did in the mid to late 1990s. And heck, they must have procured this alien flying saucer we saw at the Cairo Temple and CNC Renegade at some point in their history. Perhaps this was a Skrin craft holding knowledge of Tiberium's arrival. The purple color scheme, which had already been established for the Skrin thematically in Tiberium's Sun by this point, certainly points to that. Or it could be a craft created by Nod with Skrin knowledge, like the Skrin ship in Tib's Sun. Or it could be an alien spacecraft from a different alien race. But when I was researching online, I found 2 theories that I personally think hold the most water. The first is that it could be a Skrin spacecraft, but from earlier in its history than the design we see in Tiberium's Sun, hence its more primitive flying saucer shape. If that's the case, then yes, it very well may have been procured by the Brotherhood very early in its history. Or, according to the second theory, if Cain is truly an alien, it could very well be the spacecraft he arrived on Earth in. There's even a structure inside that kinda looks like it could be a pod for holding a living being. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below.
We need you, my brothers, to be steadfast. Do not be deterred, no matter the cost.
Thirdly, we have the Proto-Brotherhood Era, spanning, I would say, anywhere from the late 1700s to the mid-1900s. This is when Kane begins his work in earnest, building on the cultural myths of the Western world and beyond, as well as his own work to integrate himself into said myths. Kane now begins to build offshoots of the Brotherhood. Any political or religious movement in the world that serves to be a destabilizing force of said nation, Kane is now forging connections with to the Brotherhood. My only real source of evidence for this activity this far back in the past is the coincidental naming of Kane's elite cult within Nod, the Black Hand, and the Serbian anarchist group commonly seen as responsible for the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Ferdinand, which kicked off the First World War. I also don't think it's a coincidence that one of the most prominent leaders of Kane's Black Hand was one Commander Anton Slavic, known as the Serbian Wolf. So if these two organizations are indeed one and the same, or at the very least connected through Kane's efforts, then it speaks to Kane sowing chaos throughout Earth's more modern history to create a world more amenable to siding with Nod. And by the time we get to the middle of the 20th century, Kane has ingratiated not just the Brotherhood of Nod, but himself as a key advisor of one of the most powerful regimes of that time, the Soviet Union. Now, keep in mind that, as with all the quote-unquote bad guy campaigns at this time in CNC's history, everything here is technically a what-if scenario, and not strictly canon. However, it's still helpful in filling out the lore. And yes, I know that in the Allied campaign, some think that this guy is Kane, but look, I'll be honest, he's wearing a different shirt than the white one Kane always wears in the Soviet campaign, and he seems to be wearing a hat of some sort, so I can't tell if he's bald, and it's Microsoft DOS graphics. It's like trying to decipher a message in breakfast cereal. Either way, it doesn't matter. In my view, the what-if bad guy campaigns of CNC are 100% canon in the sense that it is definitely what would have happened if the bad guys succeeded and the good guys failed. So while the ultimate outcomes aren't canon, I consider any bit of world building to be canon. In this case, Kane was definitely canonically there as Stalin's secret advisor during this alternate World War II, even in the Allied campaign. We just don't necessarily see it. Now, at the end of the Soviet campaign, Europe is under the complete control of the Soviet Union. From Stalin's new headquarters in London, his celebrations are cut short as he is assassinated via poison tea and shot several times by his head of intelligence, Nadia. She then reveals to the Soviet commander, you, the player, that she is secretly a member of the Brotherhood of Nod, that Nod will tire the Soviet Empire sometime in the 1990s, when they will presumably reveal themselves to the world. She's then shot by Kane, who up to this point had never spoken in previous cutscenes. Kane then gives this cryptic remark.
Comrade Chairman, I am the future.
So, the reference to the 1990s feels like an intentional nod to the time period of Tiberian Dawn. And we know from former Westwood developers that Red Alert 1 was originally meant to be a prequel to the Tiberium universe. But fans argue to this day if that means that the Allied campaign leads to Red Alert 2, and the Soviet campaign leads to Tiberian Dawn, or if the Allied campaign leads to both, depending on if Tiberium and Kane exist or don't. I personally believe the latter. I think the Soviet campaign outlines what Nod's goals were during this time, becoming a parasite of sorts to a larger political institution in an effort to seize power. But it just doesn't make sense to me that Nod goes from running the empire that took over all of Europe to a decentralized terrorist organization in Tiberian Dawn. Plus, nothing in Tiberian Dawn indicates that this is a post-Soviet conquered Europe. Heck, Russia is its own country apart from the USSR in this era. Anyway, the upshot is that the Brotherhood of Nod's earliest guaranteed appearance seems to have been at least around the 1950s, if not earlier. This makes the most sense to me, as we see them in Tiberian Dawn with enough power to secure nearly half of the world's known supply of Tiberium, something they could not have done overnight. Now, we come to the fourth and final era of the Brotherhood's history prior to the First Tiberian War, the Powerhouse Era.
And of course, he who commands the future conquers the past. That is why I'm reaching out to you here. While a lot has changed in the 20-plus years I have been away, some things have not.
This might be the most unique version of the Brotherhood's iterations. It's the only one where they operate in a semi-legal fashion in the world economy, in addition to their military and terrorist branches. I mean, think, it's like an 1890s US Steel with the Pinkertons to back them. Or modern-day Amazon with the Pinkertons to back them? Really? Wow, okay. Anyway, it's a version of Nod we really only get for one game. Presumably through several shell companies, Nod operates with enough corporate power to be able to legally harvest and refine Tiberium before anyone else can, establishing a majority control of the alien substance. And this isn't just in disenfranchised third world areas of the planet. Kane claims that Nod was the first to discover Tiberium right where the meteor landed in the Tiber River in Italy in 1995. By the time we get to the run-up to the First Tiberium War, estimates for Nod's total economic assets total $255.2 billion US dollars. In addition to this legal soft power, the Brotherhood has and has had various connections to several terror organizations throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Everything from the Irish Republican Army, to Islamic jihadist groups, to the Communist Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, along with ties to various political movements in the US, Britain, and France. So while the Brotherhood's focus is primarily on third world nations, they are not without support and influence in first world Western nations. And last but certainly not least, the Brotherhood's military power. In addition to random acts of terror on Western nations, which presumably take a minimum of military hardware, Nod is able to bring its military might to bear in open conflict against even the might of the United Nations Global Defense Initiative. How did they accomplish this with presumably only the support of third world nations? Well, according to the Tiberian Dawn manual, Nod was able to keep its vast military power hidden, convincing even the West that Nod only consisted of smaller, disparate terror cells. That is, until a major scandal revealed that US defense contractors had been secretly supplying the Brotherhood of Nod on the side, in addition to their more legitimate contracts. This would explain how Nod was able to get their hands on US technology, like the Bradley fighting vehicle, largely assumed to be the basis for Nod's light tanks. Even with the defense contractors exposed, it was far too late. By the late 1990s, Nod had a considerable land, air, and naval force that could be deployed around the world and become more than a substantial thorn in the side of GDI.
GDI remains a thorn in my side, a sharp dagger puncturing the very back of the entire Brotherhood, and now, more than ever.
Okay, so nailing down any sort of specifics on Nod's political beliefs in the era of the First Tiberium War was very difficult. In the first game itself, the only real constants is Kane's disdain and desire for the destruction of GDI. While you as the player are often tasked with taking control of African nations through proxy wars, sabotage, and the destruction of GDI bases, it's often unclear what kind of world Nod wants once they win. However, I was able to find 3 places where any sort of specificity was communicated. Firstly, when Brotherhood Commander Seth provides you with a video giving background on Nod.
Accessing Brotherhood archives. The Brotherhood desires a world of peace, unity, and eternal brotherhood. The Brotherhood springs from the lowest of places, offering unity and peace to otherwise neglected and abused nations.
As vague as this sounds, it shows that Nod offers a vision of support for presumably third world nations that have not benefited from Western hegemony. The emphasis on peace and unity seems to be directly designed to appeal to nations plagued by anarchy and constant civil war. Given the state of most nations in Africa in the 1990s, where the Nod campaign takes place, it makes sense that this would be their central message. Nod offers a way to put a stop to the violence, a promise of lasting peace, and an end to Western interference. Second place we find specific Nod political beliefs is back in the Tiberian Dawn manual. Under ideology, it's stated that Nod's goal is, quote, to unite third world nations under a pseudo-religious political platform with imperialist tendencies. In actuality, it is an aggressive and popular neo-fascist anti-West movement vying for total domination of the world's peoples and resources. Operates under the popular mantra, brotherhood, unity, peace, unquote. So, it would seem that Nod wants to create an empire of third world nations in opposition to the West. At least, that's what they tell most people. GDI, it seems, or whoever's writing this entry in the manual, believes that Nod's true goal is total domination of all the world's peoples and resources. So, modest goals. Nod is also specifically mentioned as being popular neo-fascist. I tried getting a specific definition of neo-fascist through online research, but unfortunately, in practice, it can be a pretty broad definition encompassing any number of far-right ideologies. So, while neo-fascist policies, like an opposition to democracy and an emphasis on authoritarianism, seem quite in line with what we see of Nod throughout the series, other beliefs, like racism and nationalism, don't really line up with how Kane tends to run the Brotherhood. And remember, this manual seems to be written from a decidedly non-Brotherhood perspective, possibly GDI itself. So they could be making a sweeping generalization of a movement they don't entirely understand. This takes us to the third and final place we can find a hint to Nod's true political beliefs, also in the Tiberian Dawn manual. Under political strength, it's mentioned that Nod is, quote, believed to be the sole backers of the Fist of Allah party in Jordan, United We Stand America party in the United States, Albion First party in the United Kingdom, among others, unquote. This is what I think is the single most important piece of Nod lore in this regard. Now, the Fist of Allah certainly sounds like a stereotypical name for an Islamic extremist group, and while United We Stand could mean just about anything, Albion First seems like a nationalist, maybe even far-right political party in the UK. Notice any similarities between the three political parties mentioned here? Exactly, not much. What does a seemingly extremist Islamic group in Jordan have to do with a far-right party in the UK? From a political spectrum perspective, almost nothing. But zoom out a bit and try to take a look at the bigger picture. Kane wants to rule the world, primarily by undermining both third world countries and the West. Maybe Kane doesn't actually care about any specific political ideology, but rather wants to fund and support whatever is the most subversive and chaos-inducing movement in any given country. Given that we know he supported everything from Irish nationalists, Islamic jihadists, Cambodian communists, and far-right populists in the UK, I think this tracks. Kane can't win in an open conflict with the West, or even with most third world countries. But what he can do is sow chaos and discord, and foment revolutionary forces in whatever nation he wishes to eventually control. That, I believe, is the only true political agenda Kane actually has for the Brotherhood.
Your kind words, your faith, your devotion have not gone unnoticed. You and many brothers like you have been extolling the magnitude of my return. The excitement has been palpable.
Before we get into Nod's religious beliefs, I think it's important for us to remember two things. One, the same methods Kane uses to preach and enact his political agenda is very similar to how he handles religious outreach. So try to keep the last section of this video in mind. Two, the Brotherhood of Nod is a cult centered around Kane. And as with many cults, there is a hierarchy and levels of membership, with the stated beliefs of the cults often changing depending on where you are on said hierarchy. For example, in Scientology, they have a concept called the Bridge to Total Freedom. If you're a new acolyte, the organization sells services such as communication and life improvement courses. But as you go further up the hierarchy of the organization, donating more money and spending more time in Scientology, you are taught more and more of their esoteric beliefs and are given more authority over newer members. The highest level on the so-called Bridge to Total Freedom can only be completed on the Scientology ship Free Winds in international waters. Take that for what you will. The point I'm trying to make is that Nod's seemingly contradictory religious beliefs are par for the course with most cults, and Nod's seemingly craziest and most out there spiritual beliefs are often reserved for the higher echelons of Nod's faithful. The rank-and-file Nod soldier is probably only told the basics, so as not to scare them off. Only those who have been in the Brotherhood for years and have fully drunk the Kool-Aid get to reach full knowledge of Nod's doctrine. Now, what I'm about to present here is my best working model for Nod's beliefs just prior and during the First Tiberium War. Note that this will change as we progress down the Tiberium universe timeline, and as Kane's goals change. Remember, Kane needs Nod to believe whatever will help him achieve his ends the most efficiently, and the only consistent doctrine in the Brotherhood is Kane himself. On the first level of Nod's religious beliefs is for the Acolytes, the new recruits. They are taught what is known as the Guidance Files. There are at least 223 of these precepts, with only a handful known to us from the Command & Conquer Renegade website from back in the day, now preserved in the Ava database. See the link in the description. These guidance files teach vague, positive principles like, quote, have an open mind and an open heart, or honesty and integrity are important, and think positively, this is the way of Kane. Now, does this sound at all like the Brotherhood you know? Of course not. But again, I think that's because this is the version of the Brotherhood that's presented to new adherents to Nod. The ideas of world domination and cult-like devotion to Kane are downplayed until the new recruit has been sufficiently indoctrinated. Now, while most of these guidance files sayings are pretty fortune cookie generic, there are a few interesting ones. Ones like, quote, idols and false worship are tools of deception. Place your faith in the tangible, as the Brotherhood exists now for you. This is the way of Kane. We see here that new acolytes are vaguely taught that there is a right way and a false way to worship, and the right way is centered around the Brotherhood of Nod and Kane. Here's another one. Quote, skill in battle must be tempered by skill in peace. Balancing these elements leads to better living. To achieve peace, one must endure the hardships of warfare. Unquote. Now, this one is interesting because I believe what we're seeing here is the embryonic stage of the peace through power mentality being taught to new adherents. As one goes up the hierarchy, we start to see more of Nod's religious beliefs, which seem to be some form of universalism, focused around Abrahamic imagery and ultimately Kane himself. In the Tiberian Dawn Manual, we are given a few of Kane's aliases from around the world, among them being Cain, spelled C-A-I-N-E, Jacob, Al-Qayyum, and Amir. Jacob, of course, has significance in the Bible as the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, his name meaning heel catcher or one who deceives, before God renamed him Israel. Al-Qayyum, interestingly, is one of the names of Allah in Muslim theology, meant to capture Allah's nature as self-sustaining and ever-living. And Amir is a name of Arabic and Persian origin, meaning prince, commander, or leader. Remember what I said at the end of part 1 of this video? I think Kane spent much of his life integrating himself into the legends and beliefs of various cultures and religions to give himself and the Brotherhood spiritual legitimacy as he tried to unite all of humanity under one banner. But this just covers the Abrahamic religions. If we look a little further in the Tiberian Dawn Manual, we'll see that the Brotherhood of Nod has aliases too. The Ways of Nod, and, I have no idea how to pronounce that, among the tribes of Godin. I tried to research what these words might mean, and the only thing I was able to come up with is a Hindi book called Godan, about a poor Indian peasant and his hardships. From what I researched, this is a highly influential book in India, and its themes have ties to Hindu religious principles. This shows that Nod's religious influence permeates even further than the Abrahamic religions of the West, into Asia and likely beyond. I believe that Nod keeps this religious doctrine vague on purpose, so that it becomes easy for most of humanity's religions to project their own beliefs onto Nod, and especially Kane. Near the top of Nod's hierarchy, the top commanders and inner circle of Cain, we start to see Nod's spiritual beliefs become a little more defined. Seth, your superior officer in the first game in the Nod campaign, introduces himself as Cain's right hand. He specifically says that Nod's hierarchy goes, quote,
from God to Cain to Seth.
You know, before Cain kills Seth. It would seem that the upper echelons of Nod believe that Cain is operating with the blessings of God himself. Cain doesn't ever deny this in this era, even keeping with the theme in the name he gives to the Nod stealth tank.
I call it Ezekiel's wheel. Essentially, it's a stealth tank.
For reference, in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, the prophet Ezekiel sees visions from God of angels that look like flying, intersecting wheels with eyes all over them. If you've ever seen memes about biblically accurate angels, that's what they're referring to. Cain seems to fulfill the role of prophet in the Brotherhood's spiritual doctrine. He is claimed to have prophesied the arrival of Tiberium, and Cain himself claims that Tiberium is the future, not merely a scientific anomaly as GDI believes. This positions Cain's status as a prophet and Tiberium's importance in Nod's religious beliefs as something that was already beginning to take shape as early as the First Tiberium War. And both of these doctrines would only become more central to the Brotherhood's religious devotion in the decades to come. But we'll cover that in future videos. One more thing I wanted to address is Cain's status as the biblical Cain, and what that means for Nod's beliefs as an organization. Various members of Nod throughout the hierarchy seem to believe that Cain is in fact the Cain from the Bible who murdered his brother Abel. It's seen in Brotherhood artwork in the temples of both Sarajevo and Cairo, as well as arguably being suggested in Cain's known aliases. If this is the case, that has some disturbing implications for how the Brotherhood interprets the story of Cain and Abel. For those who believe that Cain is indeed the son of Adam and Eve, they are willingly following, serving, fighting, and dying for humanity's first murderer. And remember, it's not like they twisted the story so that Cain didn't kill Abel. Cain is depicted in the act of murdering Abel in their most venerated artwork in the temples of Nod. This could mean any number of things. The Brotherhood could interpret Abel as being the one in the wrong, and Cain being totally justified in killing his brother. Or perhaps that God even sanctioned this act. Remember, from God to Cain to Seth. They may view Cain as God's chosen agent for leading humanity. If that's the case, then they believe that Cain was right to take arms against his brother. Peace through power, indeed. And finally, there is one last section of Nod's hierarchy that needs to be addressed. Cain himself. What does Cain believe? When the GDI commando Havoc Parker approaches the supposed sarcophagus of Abel, Cain said that it was hallowed ground, and that the site was the true source of Nod's power. And remember, he's not talking to his Nod fanatics here, so is this actually what Cain believes? And if so, is there any merit to it? What does he mean by the true source of Nod's power? Does he mean that metaphorically? Ideologically? The idea that Cain was justified in his murder? Or does he mean literally? Did Cain plant the Tiberium crystals at Abel's sarcophagus after the meteor crash landed in 1995? Or was the Tiberium always there? Was this Tiberium at Abel's sarcophagus the result of Abel's blood crying out to God from the ground, as stated in the original biblical story? I don't really know, but I'm very curious to hear what you guys think. Mama Snowman and I figured this out months ago. It was right under our nose. The source of Nod's power isn't Abel's murder, not directly anyway. It's Cain's immortality. It's God's curse in response to Abel's murder that makes it so that no man can kill Cain. Every other empire in history has had mortal leaders, but Nod has lasted so long through the ages because their leader never dies. He learns from his mistakes and can accumulate centuries of knowledge and experience. It's why Nod never truly dies. Nod is immortal because Cain is immortal, and that is the true source of Nod's power.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
Now, if we take the idea that Cain is just an alien in exile, then he almost certainly believes none of the Abrahamic biblical beliefs that the Brotherhood seems to. It's all a means to an end. Religious fanatics make for obedient tools. Unless, possibly, somewhere along the line, Cain, even as an alien, started believing his own hype, so to speak. But if Cain is actually the biblical Cain, what does that mean then? Is Cain actually working at the behest of God? Was he right to kill his brother Abel in this universe? Well, I don't believe that's the case. Maybe Cain knows he was wrong to kill his brother Abel, but is trying to prove God wrong. Trying to prove that he was the brother who deserved to live. Trying to turn God's curse of immortality into an opportunity to take control of humanity, return it to the paradise lost by his parents, and prove that he is a worthy leader. And then there's GDI, seemingly only the military arm of the UN, but is somehow able to survive the Tiberium apocalypse right alongside the Brotherhood of Nod. Curious, but I'll let you, the viewer, decide if there's more to GDI than it initially appears.
Where the hell are those reinforcements?
Reinforcements have arrived.
Okay guys, not gonna lie, this was probably the hardest script to write of any video essay I've made. All the research required from the games, to old defunct Renegade website content, to languages, history, and religion. But I, at least, think it was very rewarding. I know most of you may not agree with me on the timeline I've constructed for Nod before the First Tiberium War, but keep in mind that this is just one snowman's educated guess. The most important thing, I feel, is all the evidence, however vague or sparse, that I've gathered into one video. Now, it's your turn. Go to the comments and tell me what conclusions you've reached based on the evidence I've presented here. And even if you're not going to write a comment, I encourage you to go to the comments and read what the others have had to say. I gotta say, I have an amazing community for this channel, and a lot of you have really amazing takes and well thought out conjectures for the CNC lore. And it would be a shame if some of you missed out on that. I view it as an unofficial epilogue to this video. Thanks for supporting me, guys. Thanks for watching.